7 royal surgeons failed. Then a human cook saved the dying prince with simple broth. The alarm was already screaming when I burned my hand on the pot. Not a drill alarm, not a shift alarm. The deep, resonating pulse that moved through the walls of the Vale flagship like a shockwave through water, the kind that made the floor vibrate under your boots and turned every crew member on the ship into a statue. I yanked my hand back from the burner, pressed it against my apron, and stood completely still in the middle of the galley listening to the sound change pitch. In 2 years aboard the Sovereign Reach, I had heard that alarm exactly once before. A hull microfracture in Sector 9. 17 minutes of controlled terror, and then it was over. This felt different. The pitch was lower, longer. It did not stop after 17 minutes. It did not stop at all. My name is Calvin Marsh. I am 39 years old, originally from a small town in northern England, and my official title aboard this vessel is Senior Provisions Coordinator, which is the Vale Dominion's diplomatic way of saying cook. I was one of 4 humans on a crew of 312. The others were a cargo logger named Pete Dunning, a systems cleaner named Addie Worth, and a young communications assistant named Owen Blake, who was so eager to impress the Vale that he had started blinking in their rhythm, which is deeply unsettling once you notice it. None of us were supposed to matter much. That was the arrangement. Humanity had been formally admitted into Dominion space 41 years ago, after generations of cautious observation and 2 failed diplomatic attempts. We were given access. We were given travel rights. We were given menial positions on military vessels as a gesture of cultural inclusion, which the Dominion Council described publicly as generous, and which everyone understood was the galactic equivalent of letting the new kids sit at the edge of the lunch table. I did not resent it. I had seen enough of human history to understand why an advanced civilization might want to keep its distance while it figured out what we were. I made my food, kept my galley clean, and paid attention. Paying attention was the thing I was best at. I heard about the prince through the ventilation system, the way I heard about most things. The Vale crew did not talk to us often, not out of cruelty, mostly out of the same habit that makes people stop explaining things to someone who cannot possibly understand the context. But sound travels, and I had spent 2 years learning enough of their trade language to catch the shape of a conversation even when I missed the finer points. Prince Tailvoran, first heir to the Dominion throne, had collapsed during a formal address to the fleet admirals. His crystalline nervous system, the extraordinary biological structure that made the Vale what they were, had begun to fracture. I had to look that up in the ship's public medical archive to understand what it meant. What I found was not reassuring. The Vale nervous system is not like ours. It is not soft tissue running through a body. It is a lattice, delicate and interconnected, made of biological crystal formations that conduct thought and sensation the way fiber optic cables conduct light. When it works, it is the most elegant piece of biological engineering in the known galaxy. When it fails catastrophically, each fracture creating stress on the next connection, a cascade that accelerates as it goes. The medical term for what was happening to the prince was systemic resonance collapse. The informal term, whispered between crew members in the corridor outside my galley, translated roughly as shattering from the inside. I stood at my counter and listened to the ship hold its breath. The Royal Medical Council had already convened by the time I understood what was happening. 7 surgeons. I learned their names later from Owen, who had been monitoring communications with the focused desperation of someone trying to prove his worth. There was a chief surgeon named Velorath who had practiced medicine for over 4 centuries. There was a specialist in cellular harmonics. There was a scholar surgeon who carried the entire Dominion medical archive in an implanted data structure behind his left eye socket. There were 4 others, each representing a different school of healing, developed across the 7 races of the Dominion. 7 of the finest medical minds in the galaxy, gathered around one dying boy. I started peeling vegetables because I did not know what else to do. The first failure came through about an hour in. I did not hear it directly. I heard it in the way the crew moved differently in the corridor outside, a collective change in posture that was as clear as a shout. The second failure came 40 minutes after that, then the third, and by the fourth, the ship's ambient noise had dropped so low that I could hear my own breathing. I thought about a lot of things while I peeled and chopped and moved around my galley out of pure restless habit. I thought about my years as a field medic in the Outer Rim conflicts, before Dominion contact changed everything, before I traded bandages and improvised sutures for pots and burners. I thought about the things I had learned in those years that no training manual ever covered. I thought about the soldiers I had lost and the ones I had, against every rational expectation, managed to keep alive. And I thought about my grandmother. Her name was Ruth Marsh. She was a small, precise woman who smelled of rosemary and had strong opinions about the correct way to tie a knot. She had no medical training. She had never studied biology or chemistry, or any of the sciences that underpin modern medicine. What she had was 60 years of watching people, and a deep, unshakable conviction about what a body needed when it was in trouble. She believed that fear was the second wound. The first wound was whatever had gone wrong. The second wound was the body's response to it. The panic, the acceleration, the systems turning against themselves because they had decided, on some level below conscious thought, that survival was no longer possible. She believed that your first job was not to fix the wound, but to convince the body that it did not need to panic, that it was safe, that it had time. She used to make broth when anyone in the family was sick. Not medicine, just broth. Bones and water, and a few things from her kitchen garden, simmered low and slow, until the whole house smelled like something warm and alive. She would bring it in a cup, and sit beside the bed, and talk about nothing important. The weather, the garden, a neighbor's dog, anything that was ordinary and calm and present. She said, "The body wants to survive, Calvin. Your job is just to remind it that surviving is still possible." I stood in the middle of my galley and thought about the Vale crew. 2 years of watching them, 2 years of paying attention. I thought about how a raised voice in the officer's corridor could make the kitchen assistant, a young Vale named something I could not pronounce and had privately called Wren, go completely still and tremble for several seconds before recovering. I thought about how the ambient tone of the ship, a low harmonic hum generated by the drive system, dropped slightly during maintenance cycles, and how, every single time it dropped, the crew's posture changed. Shoulders lowered, movement slowed. Something in the ship relaxed when the frequency went down. I thought about the Vale nervous system and its crystalline lattice and the way it resonated. And then I thought about a sealed medical bay full of panicking surgeons and screaming monitors, and the brightest, most clinical lighting on the ship, surrounding a boy whose body was in a feedback loop of fear so severe that the greatest doctors in the galaxy could not break it from the outside. I filled a pot with water and set it on the heat. I did not have bones aboard a Vale flagship. What I had were the Vale-safe root compounds that made up the base of most of my cooking, 3 types of dried aromatic herbs I had been growing in a small tray near the porthole, and the salt ration I was technically supposed to account for by weight at the end of each week. I added them all to the water and turned the heat to low. I found the oldest, most worn pot lid I had, the one that did not seal perfectly, and let a thin curl of steam escape, because I wanted the smell to travel. I stood there for a moment looking at the pot. Then I picked it up, carried it into the corridor, and walked to the medical bay. I want to be very clear about how frightened I was. I was carrying a pot of soup toward the Royal Medical Bay of a Dominion flagship, uninvited, during an active succession crisis, in violation of approximately 11 protocols I could name, and probably several more I did not know existed. If the surgeons threw me out, I would deserve it. If they had me detained, I would understand. I was a cook from northern England, with a grandmother's theory, and a pot of improvised broth, and absolutely no business being anywhere near this situation. I knocked on the door anyway. Velorath opened it. He was very tall, which all the Vale were, with the pale crystalline undertone to his skin that indicated age and rank. He looked down at me, the way you might look at something unexpected that has appeared on your floor. Not angry exactly, more confused, in a way that had not yet decided whether to become anger. I spoke in the trade language, slowly, because my pronunciation was genuinely bad, and I needed him to understand me. I said that I was not a surgeon. I said that I had an idea that was not surgery. I said that I had food. I said, please do not remove me before I explain. There was a long silence. He stepped aside. The medical bay was everything I expected and everything I feared. Bright as noon on a clear day, every surface reflecting light back at every other surface. The monitors were running at full alert, their harmonic tones stacked on top of each other in a frequency that set my teeth on edge. And I am human, without a crystalline nervous system, experiencing it through bone and skin. The 6 other surgeons stood in various positions around the room, most of them still holding instruments, all of them looking at me with the particular expression that crosses species lines. Who is this, and why is he here? The prince was on the treatment surface. He looked like exactly what he was, a young person, barely holding on, his skin showing the deep internal fracture lines the way ice shows stress beneath its surface, pale lines spreading outward from his sternum in every direction. I did not look at him too long. I turned to Velorath and asked, quietly, whether I could dim the room lights. He stared at me. I waited. He gave the smallest possible nod. I dimmed the lights to about 1/3 of their current level. Not dark, just low, the kind of low that feels like late afternoon, rather than a surgical theater. Then I asked if the non-critical monitors could be silenced. This produced more resistance. One of the other surgeons made a sharp sound that I recognized as objection. I said, in my broken trade language, that I only meant the secondary monitors, the ones tracking data that had not changed in the last hour. Velorath looked at the monitors for a moment. He spoke a short phrase. 4 of the 7 monitors went quiet. The change in the room was immediate and startling. It felt like taking off a heavy coat you had forgotten you were wearing. I asked the surgeons to move to the far wall. They did, slowly, with the careful compliance of people who have run out of their own ideas. I set my pot on a surface near the prince, not touching him, just close enough that the steam would reach him, and removed the lid. The smell that came out was, I freely admit, not particularly elegant. It was earthy and faintly sweet, and very much alive. The smell of something that had been simmering for 40 minutes over low heat. The smell of roots and herbs, and warm salt water doing what they had been doing in kitchens since before humanity could write it down. I sat on the floor beside the treatment surface, cross-legged, at his level. And I started talking. Not about medicine, not about his condition or the ship or the crisis. I talked about the vegetables I had been peeling when the alarm went off. I described the root compound that the Veil calls something unpronounceable, and that I had privately decided to call a parsnip, because the shape was similar, and it made me feel at home. I talked about the way the galley looked in the early morning, before the crew woke, how the light came in through the porthole, and made the hanging pots cast round shadows on the ceiling. I talked about my grandmother's garden, the way the rosemary grew against the south wall and smelled strongest in late summer. I talked very quietly, slowly, in a low, even voice. I do not know how long it took. I was not watching the monitors. I was watching the prince's face, which was turned slightly toward me, in the way that a body turns toward warmth without the mind deciding to. Velorath made a sound, low, involuntary, the kind of sound that bypasses dignity entirely, because the body makes it before the mind can intervene. I had heard that sound once before, in a field camp, from a doctor who had been certain a patient would not make it through the night, and had just watched the patient's vital signs stabilize against every expectation. It is the sound of someone encountering an outcome they had stopped allowing themselves to believe in. I kept talking. The fracture lines on the prince's skin did not heal. I want to be precise about that, because I have heard the story told several ways since, and some versions have become dramatic, in ways that are not accurate. The lines did not close. What happened was subtler, and in its own way more significant. The spreading stopped. The cascade, the runaway acceleration of each fracture causing the next, simply decelerated and then ceased. His body stopped destroying itself. I talked about nothing in particular for another hour. The pot steamed gently beside me. The room stayed dim. The surgeons stayed against the far wall, watching their instruments with expressions I could not read but recognized by their stillness. When the prince's eyes opened, I was in the middle of a sentence about a particular evening in my grandmother's kitchen, when the power had gone out, and she had continued cooking by candlelight without breaking stride, because, she said, the soup does not care about the electricity. His eyes were pale, the veil equivalent of gray, and they took several seconds to focus. When they did, they found me, a human man sitting cross-legged on the floor of a royal medical bay, holding a conversation with no one in particular. He said, in a voice that sounded like cracked glass slowly pulling itself back toward whole, "Something smells wrong." I laughed before I could stop myself. It came out short, and surprised, and completely genuine, and it rang off the walls of that silent room like something that had been waiting for permission. I said that it was broth, human broth, that it smelled different, not wrong. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "You are a cook." I said yes. He said, "Not a surgeon." I said, "Definitely not a surgeon." There was a silence that was, remarkably, not uncomfortable. Then he said, with enormous effort and a particular quality of stillness that I would later understand was how the veil expressed something they are not accustomed to expressing. "It does not smell entirely unpleasant." I said, "Thank you, Your Highness." He closed his eyes again, not in the way of someone losing consciousness, in the way of someone deciding, on a level beneath thought, that sleep is now safe. The formal inquiry came 3 days later. I sat in a small room across a table from 2 Dominion officials, who read me a list of protocols I had violated and asked me to account for each one. I accounted for them, one by one, because they were correct about every item on the list, and I had no defense to offer beyond the one I gave, which was that I thought it might help, and I was out of reasons not to try. Velorath submitted a statement. I never read it in full, but Owen Blake, who had been monitoring everything with the dedication of a person compiling a personal archive, told me later that it described my intervention as introducing variables outside the surgical framework that produced outcomes the Council had not anticipated. He said it had the tone of a man writing very carefully around something that had surprised him more than he intended to admit. The prince dismissed the inquiry with a single word. The officials closed their folders and left. I went back to the galley. That evening, I recorded a message home. I do not remember exactly what I said. Something about my grandmother's broth recipe, the one she made me memorize at age 8, standing in her kitchen in my socks, while she recited each step twice, and made me repeat it back. The one I had always thought of as food and nothing more. I told whoever was going to listen to the message, and I did not specify, that the recipe had turned out to be something else as well. That the galaxy is very large and very old and has learned extraordinary things, and that sometimes a thing gets overlooked, not because it is small, but because it is too simple to be taken seriously by people who are very smart. I told her, as if she could still hear it, that she had been right. That a body in trouble does not first need intervention. It needs to stop being afraid. It needs warmth and quiet, and the particular reassurance that ordinary living things still exist and are close by. Everything else comes after. I sent the message. I cleaned my pot. I turned off the galley light and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to the ship move around me, the deep hum of the drive, the distant sound of 300 crew members going about their lives, the ship pressing forward through the dark at the edge of a galaxy that was, slowly and imperfectly, learning what humans actually are. Then I went to bed. In the morning, I peeled vegetables and started a new pot, and the Sovereign Reach moved on.